Good afternoon, and a huge thanks to B&H and Lexar for inviting me to do this presentation. And above all, thank you all for being here. My name is Jay Dickman. I'm a Lexar Elite photographer. I'm a National Geographic Contributing photographer. I've been in the business many years. This is about my fourth optic I think I've done. I really love working with these folks at B&H. David Brommer's been great on these. I want to talk about travel photography, something that has been missing on most of our itineraries for many months now. After a year of essentially no travel, many of us are just starting to hit the road again. As a geographic contributing photographer, most of my work is with our expedition side as a lecturer and expert. Over 2019 into the first few months of 2020, into the first month of 2020, I shot in about 40 countries. So travel is a major part of my world. In the past couple of months, I finally started getting out to travel personally again. Oh, it felt so great. My first trip was to Big Bend National Park, which is a designated international dark sky site. In this talk, I'd like to provide some ideas to get back out on the road and to shake that rust off that I know so many of us have acquired in these past months of the pandemic. After our Big Bend trip, I drove up to Badlands National Park, actually a couple of times, as this park has really stunning landscape opportunities. This photo was shot in the Yellow Mountains area, and it speaks to an obvious tip of travel photography: get out early or stay out late. Not only do you beat the crowds, but you get to work in the golden hour, which is potentially a great window of time to shoot after sunset and before total darkness. And that's where there's just enough ambient light in the sky to record the landscape as well as the sky. And when adding introduced light, you can get a strong photo. Mixing warm and cold color light can create a photo that is appealing to us intellectually because we like that mix of warm and cold. If any of you were in Art 101, you remember the color wheel. When you have colors across from each other, complementary colors, that when you combine those in a photograph, you create an appealing photo to us. Well, Arches National Park was a perfect example of how this summer is going to be in terms of crowds in many, if not all, national parks. Here, we hiked up to Delicate Arch near dusk, and it provided a productive scene as we had a few minute blasts of sunlight as the day's end. And the cloudy sky provided an interesting layer and background. So in this pristine location with this iconic geological feature, so great to be alone in a moment like this, isn't it? Oh, you just get to see these amazing things. However, this is the reality of the scene. I was there with 150 of my new best friends. Part of the job of the photographer is to create a unique image out of a much photographed place. Already, we're seeing reports from Arches and other national parks that if you're not there by 7 a.m. or so, you may encounter a park close, come back in several hours sign, as we saw when we exited Arches at around 9 a.m. We'd gotten out there at about 5. There was still a crowd. The parking lot was full at 5 a.m., but people hiking up to Delicate Arch. And several national parks have instituted a reservation system, even for entering the park. Check with your intended destination park to see restrictions that may be imposed. And don't forget to check into your state parks, which may often see less crowds, less intensity of visitors. Dead Horse Point State Park in Utah, in between Canyonlands and Arches, had a handful of visitors when we were visiting that area. And of just a couple of weeks ago, this was a list of the national parks that are requiring reservations, not just camping reservations, just to get into the park. So check it out. This is important stuff for you. But if you're willing to get up early, the photographic possibilities in these parks can be spectacular. The windows in Arches National Park, with a little cloud cover, again, in the sky, you often get a much more interesting background. A solid blue sky can actually be really boring. So when you have that little feathery clouds in the sky, oh, it's a great time to shoot. How can I incorporate? I use several weather apps like Weather Live and Carrot, as well as photographic apps like TPE and Photo Pills to help set up a shoot. These give great information on sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset, as well as potential cloud cover. where you're in a dark sky, international dark sky area, when a front may be moving through. Great information for the photographer. Often in these national parks, when you have a cold front coming through, that kind of washes out the sky and can create a really intense lighting situation. I'll talk a little further in a minute about minimizing the gear I carry. In terms of filters, I only carry a couple with me. I carry ND Grad and polarizer, and I use a Stingray high-lux filters in place of a UV or haze filter. I also carry the Stingray ND Grad filter all the times with me, and there are those times where the sky is simply too bright to capture in a single exposure with a darker foreground. So you have to take control of that scene and essentially compress the two extremes of light so the sensor can record the full value of that light. Again, here in Badlands, it's just such a spectacular place. In our workshops, we emphasize to our participants that they react to what is engaging them in a scene, what's resonating with you, what drives you to be turned on by that scene, and let that drive the energy of the photo. So in this particular image, those grasses in the foreground were so beautiful, I wanted to incorporate them with that lunar landscape. And a young photographer in Badlands gave me an interesting component in this late day. This was a bit of visual interest to the photo. As a young guy is doing something one would expect, taking a photo of the sunset. I also like how the colors, the palette is the same on him as it is in the background. That entire afternoon had been cloudy. Then the last couple of minutes before sunset, the sun came out. We had spectacular light for just a couple of minutes. This is one of the cardinal rules of photography. You have to be ready. That camera goes on around your neck. You're thinking and seeing photographically. So that whole thing of getting back out to me has been of huge importance, simply to get back into that mental framework of shooting. I do want to talk further on rebooting this process of travel. And I just want to kind of show this kind of mini story of a group of pictures I did on a National Geographic expedition to northern Queensland and Papua New Guinea, one of the last trips I did before the pandemic. Actually, one of the very first assignments I did for National Geographic was in Papua New Guinea, where I photographed and lived with a primitive culture for several months. These photos are not from that, but from this recent expedition in 2019, one of the last before the pandemic. We were really lucky to get to go to southern Papua New Guinea and photograph the Asmat people. What I tell folks in workshops is react to what you're seeing. How can I convey that photographically? As we approach the landing in the boat, the crowds of kids waiting on the shore for us was really a nice photo opportunity. And I'd mentioned trying to shoot in a good light time of day, but there are those events that dictate a not so great time of day, or the trip you're on simply may not offer the opportunity to choose the time of your visit. So use the light with which you're dealt. In this particular image, I really like the harsh light of on these indigenous dancers and the fact that the sand was acting as a reflector, bouncing light back up into their faces. That's the challenge of photography I really love. The fact that every situation brings its own unique set of problems. And our job is to address and answer those issues. It's a constant thing of problem solving. I love this craft. Shooting a very tight portrait of this Asmat warrior allows the photo to contain what was so striking about this guy to me when I walked up to him. I love traveling light. And in terms of equipment, there's a subject that's near and dear to me, and I'll often use one camera and one lens. Here I was using the Olympus 12-100, effectively a 24-200. And with my Lexar 2000X card, I'm often surprised when I see a traveler who spent a lot of money on travel and on equipment. And most importantly, they're investing a lot of time in this particular trip, traveling to a far off or even not so far off destination. Then they decide to save a few dollars by purchasing inexpensive X brand memory, and they're surprised when they have a failure. On my geographic expeditions, I'm often downloading my cards several times a day and reformatting when I put the card back in the camera. With hundreds of cycles, I've never had a failure with the Lexar card. But to go back to what I was talking about, traveling with minimal gear is liberating. And if you think of back to a lot of those famous photographers that I grew up with looking at their work, who shot everything with either the 35, 50, or 90, and you look at the quality of their work and their images, it's an incentive to minimize. One of the other benefits of traveling light, you're simply less of a target for nefarious activities. My small Olympus looks less desirable to a thief than a really large DSLR or mirrorless camera. And the more I can disappear into the woodwork, the more likely it is that the photographic opportunities that present themselves to me, I may be able to work more effectively. Here's a bunch of hazmat warriors heading back, taking their dugout to the ocean. As photographers, I like to work a situation where I'm kind of constantly moving, looking for an interesting perspective or a great character as this warrior. And with less gear and not carrying a camera bag, I find I can connect and focus on my subject and be less intimidating. Our audience, when we return home, love to see people pictures. It's how we connect as we're visual creatures, thinking, processing, recalling in still images. And when you bring eyes into a photograph, you force a connection with the audience. So here are the 5 tips for re-entering that world of travel photography. Get out early, plan on staying out late. Plan ahead when you're going to pack in your camera case. If you're going to do wildlife, that's one set of gear. If it's street photography, you can really minimize. Research the area. I find that about 70% of my assignments are devoted to research. Get out and shoot, even in the neighborhood, the park, or the zoo. Get back into that mindset of photography so that you're thinking and seeing photographically. And when you photograph people, don't try to sneak pictures. If there's a great moment, I'm going to shoot it. But then I'm going to move in and make eye contact, smile. That can go a long ways. Set the camera in your preferred shooting mode so when it's on around your neck, it's ready to go. Being visual creatures, we really process our thoughts through still imagery. If I mention your first birthday, your first pet, the Vietnam War, shock and awe, the city of London, I could go on and on. But when I mention those, a still image, more likely than not, was generated in your mind. That's the power of still photography, because that's how we think and process and recall. And when we take more than 2 photos of an experience or a trip, we can empower that body work by creating a narrative. I've spent a lifetime as a photojournalist working with visual narrative, and I know the idea of creating a story through photographs is incredibly important, especially now with an audience that generally gives an online image a half second of attention. If we travel somewhere new and somewhere different, and we want to share those pictures with family and friends, they want to see what that place is like. They want to see the grand overview. That sense of place photo provides that visual information that can tell our audience both what this place looks like and why it's important. This demands that you create an image that is more than simply a pretty picture. It's conveying not only information, but it establishes with the audience what that place looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like. Is it hot? Is it cold? You can feel the sea breeze. This is when a successful narrative starts. And creating that powerful sense of place picture grabs your audience by the eyeballs and accomplishes one of the more important components of visual narrative, engaging your audience. Today on Facebook and Instagram, 2 of the prime platforms for sharing pretty pictures with an audience with an attention span of milliseconds, your job is to build a story that goes far beyond pretty. That sense of place picture doesn't have to be the opener. And I'm going to give you 5 components of visual narrative. You can mix them up however you want. There'll be one that'll be obviously at the end. And the process of culling down your body of work is one of the more important components. What do you leave in? What do you leave out? It's the evidence of the weak link theory. If you have strong photo, strong photo, strong photo, weak photo, what do you think is going to be remembered? If you want to get a great review on all your pictures, ask your mom to look at your photographs. If you want to get a good review on your body of work, bring in someone whose work you respect, and they can give you an honest feedback on what's working and what's not. If you try to describe what kind of photographer I am, I'm a generalist. I photograph war, wildlife, sports, human issues, travel, on. And I try to approach every situation with the idea that there's a best picture to be made in that situation. And look for that sense of place image. It might surprise your audience. and they can then disassemble what's going on in that image. That's, again, where you've got them, where you've engaged them. And as photographers, look up, look down. Don't ever shoot everything from your respective 6'2", 5'4" perspective. Bring a different look to something. Sand dunes in Namib's Naukluft National Park are huge, so scale is an important consideration while photographing this guy walking down one of the sand dunes. So you bring all these different approaches. And again, what I said I love about photography, it's always that challenge. What can I do in this situation? You pick the camera up to your face, it changes every moment. Second component of that visual narrative, it's really important to share with our audience who these people and or critters are that inhabit this place we're visiting. When you see a photo that grabs you, whether it's yours or someone else's, break it down. Why is this working? This is really important to you as a photographer. As photographers, part of our job is to bring information and a new way of seeing a scene. In South Georgia, this fur seal pup coming up to the water, I've got an underwater housing doing one of the half in, half outs. You build your photograph. And who can take a bad puffin photo? Pretty impossible to miss with these incredible birds. Here I use an 840 millimeter equivalent lens that really isolated the bird. It put it on one plane of interest, the background just melts out of focus, or use a super fast lens shot at f1.2 that allows that background to melt out of focus, that reinforces the eyes of the sadhu in Pashupatinath temple in Kathmandu. We're using black and white for this portrait of another sadhu. You know, eyes are so critical in pictures, and when you bring catch lights into the eye, you bring energy to the photograph. So this group of pictures are portraits, both environmental or more traditional. So here in this guy in Greenland, this boat captain, I use the metal framework of the port that he's steering through to frame him. So more of a traditional portrait. You know, and by bringing the background information in on this environmental portrait of this albatross chick, it tells us something about this critter's world. This is really important. This is probably not Kansas. So what's the next element in that visual narrative thing? It's detail. Usually these are very close pictures that forces the viewer to possibly engage with seeing in a different way than they had thought of. Here I'm photographing a baboon in the Serengeti, and look at that water. It looks like a tear on its nose, and the intensity of its eye, that incredible fur going off of its face. Detail, like I said, is, you know, you have landscape, which is made up of all this minutia of detail. So when we shoot detail, we kind of take our audience by their eyes and say, look at this. You're taking control of how they see something. Or a bunch of dead termites in a mud puddle in Namibia. I thought it looked like a painting, but again, it's that important information that we can share with our audience. This is important stuff. You go from that big, wide, sense of place landscape to that tight detail picture. You're controlling what they see. And you can tell by this guy's hands, he's probably not a hedge fund manager. This is a wrangler in Wyoming. You know, I'm kind of constantly looking at my scene. What can I photograph in this thing? And this guy's hands are amazing. And the cigarette, all these elements came forward to bringing information in that tells our audience about something. Detail's an important factor to bring to your audience. So you move from detail into moments. Oh my gosh. Moments brings that element of power and energy to your story. Here a group of penguins are leaping off of an iceberg into the ocean in the Antarctic. I love this. Kind of looks like a textbook on how penguins should dive into the water. Each one's got its perfect little motion. Shooting a high shutter speed on this to capture that moment. Moment doesn't always dictate needing a high shutter speed. What's the best shutter speed to use? It depends. I wanted to emphasize the speed of this cheetah in Namibia. I shot her with a 600 millimeter lens at 1/30th of a second as she ran by. Let's run back to a higher shutter speed because this lion was laying on a rock in the Serengeti. And I'm going to talk about giving this process time too. Sometimes those things don't happen immediately. We waited with this cat for about an hour. She's on top of a kopi, which is a rock outcropping in the Serengeti. She gave us all these different views. You work that situation. We had this great overcast sky, which gave great soft light. And like I've said, sometimes this takes time. If you have that great fortune of getting to go on a safari in Africa, and you get to talk to your potential fellow safari vehicle accomplices, kind of make sure some of these people that go to Africa are looking for the big five. And they drive up to a scene and there's a line, they check it off. Let's go. Let's move on to the next scene. This thing takes time sometimes. So kind of just check and see if those people in your vehicle are on that same mindset to get those moments can happen. Another moment of a croc in the Serengeti. It was parked below a small waterfalls on the Grumeti River, waiting for something to be swept into its mouth. About a 30th of a second, got an ND filter on there to knock the light down. Again, you look at a scene, what can I do to accomplish what I think is magical about this? Or a photo of this banded sea crate as it dove for the bottom of the ocean. We were snorkeling with them. It's about 10 times the toxicity of a cobra. And they kept telling me like, oh, they're very reticent critters, don't make it mad. So snorkeling around in this, I was thinking like, what makes a banded sea crate mad? Well, never figured that one out, but it didn't bite me. But I shot at a high shutter speed of 1,000th of a second with a super wide angle lens at f14. So I had a huge depth of field because these things happen so quickly, you've got to be ready. Moment doesn't have to be a warm or cold-blooded subject. Here, a breaking wave in front of an iceberg in the Southern Ocean. I just love this thing with this cold palette going on across the picture with this wonderful little moment of that wave cresting. One more reason I don't ride rodeo, besides the fact I don't ride horses very well. I shot NFL football for many years, and the rule of thumb there was 1/500th of a second to start stopping human motion. This horse moves a lot faster than a human. So I was up at 1,000 or 12/50th of a second to get this incredible moment of this wrangler getting, dropped off the horse. High shutter speed. That was what I needed for this. But shutter and aperture and manual and program, those modes are creative tools on your camera. How can I convey the speed with which these porpoises were moving as they were bow riding off the wake of our ship in the South Pacific? I shot a 30th of a second. I have a little bit of sharpness. What we look for in photographs, eyes and sharpness. So I have some sharpness for your eyes to rest upon. The picture worked to me. Or again, a quiet moment along the Antarctic Peninsula of a group of penguins as they're porpoising. They jump out of the water as they're blasting through the ocean. And I just love this kind of three components: foreground, midground, background. Kind of a simple picture. So combining sense of place with moment in this photograph. Steeple-Jason Island is known for its world's largest black-browed albatross colony. And as I was walking on this trail to this colony, this caracara tried to scare me off, intimidate me. Typical behavior for this bird, but I just love this thing of including place with moment. And you get to the colony and you get an environmental portrait. It's an amazing place. These chicks sitting atop these incredible nests. I thought this worked nicely for an environmental portrait. And again, I've said earlier, culling your pictures down is one of the toughest parts of this whole process. Less is more. Make sure all those pictures work. Finally, you close out your narrative with a closing photograph. Those first four components can be mixed up any way you want, but the closer really needs to be at the end. Closers are usually simple. They're often early or late in the day because we connote that with end of day. The photo doesn't start a new narrative. It wraps things up. Closers are quiet, simple pictures, but important to let your audience go out of your narrative. Here are those 5 components of visual narrative. There won't be a test on this. So anyway, here's to your next trip, whether to your local state park or to Kathmandu. Above all, simply shoot. The more you shoot, the more comfortable you'll be with the process of photography. The more you know about the camera, the more the camera gets out of the way. You want that camera to be a conduit between what's going out in front of you and your brain. We have this tool, the camera, to record our existence, our experiences. Just do it. So I want to thank B&H and Lexar for having me. I love doing these presentations. I love photography. It's very important to us. It's an intellectual challenge. It keeps us moving forward as people. I hope our paths cross, whether in the field or at another seminar. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time hugely.